how exactly do you see this shaping up?
Sure. Thanks very much, Nolan. So I'm with HSBC and I co-head the debt capital markets business in Asia Pacific, which effectively is the bond market issuance division within the bank. And it's really been an incredibly rapidly moving market, right? If you look at on the bond side of things, if you look at green and social bond market development, back 5 years ago, 2015, it was about 16 billion worth of issuance, right? And if you look at 2019, there was 110 billion worth of issuance. So it's a huge, rapid development of this market in terms of investors getting involved in bond issuances, which have either a green or a social label. In terms of the total, that's about 325 billion or so outstanding at the moment. And actually, Asia Pacific was quite slow in the initial stages of this market, the development of this market, but it has caught up very rapidly. So approximately 60 billion or so now comes out of Asia, right? And if you look at that in terms of, how that's split, it's just over 50% is actually green. And then there's, about a third of it is social, and relatively small proportion of it is now related to sustainability, but that piece is actually growing quite fast. So if you put that into context, like for example, we were very lucky to be able to work with the Republic of Indonesia in their first green sukuk issuance that Pak Luki mentioned. And it was quite funny because when we went around the Asian investor base, most of them were saying, what is green? And then we went to meet the green investors in Europe, and most of them were saying, what's a sukuk, right? So there's clearly, there was a very developed kind of green market in Europe, but less familiar with, the Asian issuance formats of sukuk. And so it's taken a little bit of time for that to develop. And there was a lot of education that went into that process by the Republic of Indonesia, really groundbreaking work, particularly with the green investors in Europe, to understand the perspectives of Asian issuers, but also, perhaps more importantly, with Asian investors to try and understand, what green meant. And we've seen huge development over the last couple of years in terms of that change. So I think it's also important to recognize that there's different layers of how investors treat green, right? So there's a very small subset of the market which is pure green, right? So call it circa 10 billion or so worth of issuance of asset under management. So it's actually quite a small pool, which will only buy green, right? Then there's about 120 billion, which has an ESG or a SRI label, right? So it's specifically around ESG, but it's broader definition of it, right? Including social, etc. But actually, if you look at the assets under management, there's about 6 trillion or so of investors which say we're managing these assets, but we are applying ESG into every decision we make. So we will not buy you unless you have a very clear and transparent strategy around ESG. And so I think it's important to recognize that it's actually that shift of the 6 trillion that's driving the market, not the specialist funds of 10 billion. I mean, those specialist funds are useful, but it's actually the broad shift of the investor base into wanting to know what every issuer is doing on ESG. That's the bit that's really going to change the market. And so, for us, that's a big commitment. And you can see it, for example, in governments announcing a target of net zero or signing up to Paris agreements, and how does that impact behaviors? That's the really important decision that's going to be driving the market for the next, 10, 20 years. Yeah.
So, Sean, did I hear you right when you said that Indonesia, when they launched this groundbreaking work, HSBC was a part of that initiative?
Yeah, so we helped them with developing the framework, but it was really a very interesting piece because, to Pak Luki's point, and I think this is one of the big benefits of actually issuing a green bond, right? Is it actually operationalizes the strategy. So if you've got an ESG strategy at the top level, well, that's great, but actually to make it work, what you need is you need everybody at the, in the case of a government, at the and at the ministry level to be able to implement that strategy. And when you do a green bond, it actually forced the government to go to every ministry and say, well, what is your plan in terms of deploying the funds? What projects do you have that can qualify for this green bond? So it really pushes down the behaviors that link to that strategy. And I think when you do it in a corporate as well, what we've seen is one of the biggest benefits of establishing a framework and issuing a bond is it actually pushes the entire organization's goals to align with that framework. And it really changes behaviors in a way that, you know, if you don't do the work, it's very difficult to get that coordination required to really change the organization.